What's up guys, AJ here. So we have the MacBook Air with the M1 chipset, and you guys may know that the next generation MacBooks are going to be launched very soon. And over the course of this video, I'm going to talk about the features of this MacBook and should you buy this MacBook right now or wait for the next gen MacBooks. And also I'll be doing a small comparison with the MacBook Pro so that you guys can decide which one to go for. The M1 powered MacBooks, Apple is making big claims in terms of the performance and battery life jump when compared to the last generation Intel MacBooks. But design wise, both of these MacBooks are very similar. They have the same 100% recycled aluminum body, and there is a glossy fingerprint magnet Apple logo in the center, and there is a 3.5mm headphone jack on the right and two USB Type-C ports on the left side. And this is not just a regular USB Type-C, it is Thunderbolt 3/USB 4. That means it can do data transfer up to 40 gigabits per second, and also you can connect to a monitor using HDMI up to 6K at 60 FPS resolution. And you'll have to buy a separate adapter to connect to a monitor, as there's no HDMI port or a USB type A port with this MacBook Air, and it's probably never going to come back, at least with the MacBook Air, because it's going to make the laptop thicker and heavier. Speaking of heavy, the MacBook Air weighs 1.29 kilograms, which is very light to hold on hand, and I really like this wedge shaped design. And since this body is made of aluminum, it is not as durable as the stainless steel found on the iPhone. So you might not want to go hard on the smooth surface, as it could get scratched. But the benefit of aluminum is that it is cheaper and helps reduce weight. I also like this hinge mechanism of the MacBook Air, which feels very robust and not shaky. And the weight distribution is very accurate, so opening the MacBook with one hand is not an issue. The keyboard on the MacBook Air is the new scissor keyboard, which has 1mm of key travel, and it is good enough. And this keyboard is also backlit and also can adjust the brightness based on the ambient lighting. There is also a Touch ID sensor on the top right of the keyboard, which is very fast and convenient. The trackpad below is a very convenient way to navigate between apps and desktops, and the gestures are very smooth and it gives you a very good haptic feedback. And even though I use a mouse with my MacBook Air, I still bring my other hand over the trackpad to use those extra features, and it makes navigating very easy and quick, and I really like this trackpad on the MacBook Air. Now let's talk about the display. So the MacBook Air has a 13.3-inch 1440p LCD display which has very good colors thanks to True Tone, and the viewing angles are very good even though this is an LCD display. The peak brightness of this display is 400 nits, and it is good for most situations, even outdoors. But under direct sunlight, there are some difficulties in reading. But the MacBook Pro has 500 nits of brightness, which is 100 more nits than this MacBook Air. So if you want more brightness, you can get the MacBook Pro. So this is a recording from the webcam of the MacBook Air. What do you guys think of the audio and video quality? I could see a lot of grain on my shirt, and take a look at my phone. The darker areas are still grainy. Apple said with their M1 chip they have improved the image signal processing, but the hardware of the camera is still not that good, so the image quality is still not that really good. For speakers, you get a stereo speaker setup on the left and right side of the keyboard, which is very loud and has good bass to it. And it also has support for Dolby Atmos playback. And overall, it's a very good experience with these speakers. Now let's talk about the brains of the MacBook Air, that is the Apple M1 chip. So this is the first MacBook to get Apple's own homemade silicon instead of the Intel processors seen before. And this M1 chip is made based on the Apple A14 Bionic chip seen on the iPhone 12 series. So this chipset integrates major aspects of a laptop into a single chip, which gives you amazing performance and efficiency. And this M1 chip is made based on the latest 5nm architecture, which gives you amazing efficiency. The M1 MacBook Air and Pro are the first laptops to get a mobile based 5nm chipset, and the M1 chip has 8 core of CPU and 8 core of GPU, which gives you amazing performance, and performance is not an issue with any of these MacBooks. With the new M1 MacBook Air, Apple has removed the internal cooling fan, And now the M1 chip can only cool using a thin heatsink and the aluminum body, which is not as effective as having a fan. And also once this heatsink has absorbed all the heat it can, the M1 chip will have to throttle and reduce its performance in order to maintain the temperature. So if you do intensive tasks for a long time in the MacBook Air, the performance will start to drop very quickly. But the MacBook Pro does have an internal cooling fan. So if you want more sustained performance when you're gaming or editing, you can go for the MacBook Pro. Now let's talk about the battery life. So even though the battery size is same as the last gen MacBook at 49.9 watt hours, but with the efficiency of the new M1 chip, this MacBook Air gives you at least 6 hours of more video playback time when compared to the Intel MacBooks of early 2020. And this MacBook Air can give you at least 2 days of battery life with normal use. But the MacBook Pro has bigger battery and gives you more battery life. But I would say most people are going to be satisfied with the battery life of the MacBook Air. And there is a 30-watt charging brick with a USB Type-C to C cable in the MacBook Air's box. For software, the MacBook Air is currently running on the latest macOS Big Sur 11.6, and I really like the way how the app icons are shaped equally to give it a clean look, and the gestures work really well on the software, and it is one of the best user interfaces that I've ever seen. Now let's talk about the storage and RAM options of the MacBook Air. So the base model of the MacBook Air gets 256 GB of internal storage and 8 GB of RAM. And you can increase the storage up to 2 TB and increase the RAM up to 16 GB. And for increasing from one RAM option to the other or from one storage option to the other, you'll have to pay extra $200, which is not really worth it in my opinion. So buy the extra storage or RAM if you think you really need them. And the base model of the MacBook is good enough for most of the people. But there is a caveat here. The base model of the MacBook Air with the 256 GB internal storage only gets 7 core of GPU, and Apple didn't mention this in their launch event, but if you check their website you can find this. So if you want the 8 core GPU version, you have to buy the 512GB or the higher storage variants of the MacBook Air. But this doesn't affect the CPU. All the MacBook Air models still have the 8 core CPU. So if you want the extra core of GPU and more storage, the MacBook Air with the 512GB will be my pick. Here are a few complaints that I have about this MacBook Air. Number one is my MacBook is turned off and I see a dirt on the keyboard and I wipe it off with my hand, but when doing that I press one of the keys and then the MacBook Air boots when you press any key on the keyboard and also when you open the lid, which is a very annoying feature, and Apple could have removed this way before and they have not done it yet. But they have fixed some of these issues with the Intel MacBooks, but not with the M1 versions. Number two, the bezels around the MacBook Air is very thick when compared to Windows laptops at their price point, which makes the design of the display look very bad, just like the notches on the iPhones. Number three is that the aspect ratio of the MacBook Air is not the standard 16:9 aspect ratio. It's a 16:10 aspect ratio display. So if you're watching a YouTube video like this one, you will see black bars on the top and the bottom. And since this is not an LCD display and can display pure blacks, you will notice it more easily. So should you spend the extra $200 and get the MacBook Pro? So the MacBook Pro has the same display as the MacBook Air, but with 100 more nits of brightness, and the MacBook Pro has a touch bar on top of the keyboard, and also the MacBook Pro has bigger battery and an internal cooling fan which gives you better sustained performance and battery life. So I would recommend you to save the $200 and buy the MacBook Air because the MacBook Air has enough battery life and performance for most of the people. And getting a touch bar for this extra money is not that really worth it. So getting the MacBook Air is a better choice unless you do some heavy intensive work for a long time. So there is one last question. Should you wait for the new M1X MacBook or buy this M1 MacBook right now? I would ask you to wait because according to the leaks, the new M1X MacBooks are going to have a 10-core CPU and a 16-core GPU, which takes the amazing performance of this M1 to a next level. And if Apple manages to launch that MacBook at exactly the same price, it is going to be worth waiting for it. And when the new MacBook launches and you're not satisfied with the price or something else, then you can get this old MacBook at even a cheaper price. Comment down below your opinion on would you spend the extra $200 and buy the MacBook Pro over the Air. And hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, do smash the subscribe button and drop a like, and I'll see you guys in the very next video.